Welcome back to Veronica Live. And I've got Congressman Geoff Davis on the phone. He served in Kentucky. For how many years did you serve up in that great state?
8 years.
Excellent.
8 years.
And I've got Statesman John Salick is joined us this morning, too, as my wingman. And we have so much to talk about, Congressman. I know yesterday I talked with you for an hour, and I could have spent hours because you're so worldly. And I guess let's just kick it off with one of the topics that you moved me the most as we were getting ready for the show was Ukraine. And you really feel that we need to support Ukraine. And I want you to tell us why, because I think we've given, I don't know if the number is 160 billion. It's so much money we've sent that direction. And why should Americans continue to support Ukraine, sir?
Well, first of all, one thing to clarify, the European Union has given significantly more humanitarian financial aid by order of magnitude over what the United States has done, even though their military assistance has been, somewhat less, largely due to a smaller industrial base. But the one thing that's a fact that's getting missed in this, and I'm so disappointed in fellow Republicans in particular that are parroting a lie that says we're sending money, to Zelensky's bank account or to, this corrupt official or that one. The reality is that the vast majority of the money that was appropriated previously in support of Ukraine was going to create U.S. jobs and help us restart our industrial base for munitions in particular, which is in critical condition right now, considering the likelihood of a peer-to-peer war. And forgetting for a moment some of the dysfunction of the current administration, the decision to support Ukraine is in fact the right one from a strategic standpoint. You see an alignment, not unlike, it's not the same. So, but history does echo, to paraphrase the statement or rhyme. And, we have an alignment of authoritarian powers that do not have the interests of free people. They do not focus on freedom and justice. They do not focus on truth. They're driven largely by misinformation in terms of how they subjugate their people. And they've created external PR operations, just like the 1930s, we see it today. We literally had people standing up at CPAC saying that their objective was to do away with democracy, period. And that authoritarian structures are more effective. And the last time that we went through that in any kind of momentum in this country was in the period between 1937 and 1941. And it took the shock of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor to wake America up to the fact that we have threats in the world. And as I said in July when I was on, you have essentially a minority of people in the world that live in free nations, but we control the vast majority of economic power and can use that for good. And in this case, having spent, I joined the Army nearly 48 years ago, but the one thing that I would tell you is the threat from Russia is very real. And when it ignited was really in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, when Putin laid the gauntlet down of what his strategic objective was to reconstitute some form of the Russian Empire. And he's taken steps to do that. He began with his toe in the water with Georgia. He's certainly committed endless atrocities in Chechnya. The Russian army is committing atrocities as part of their doctrine. And they are a threat to the West, and they have threatened NATO partners. They've threatened Western partners. And he's even threatened a nuclear attack on the United States. So, when we were young, let's say in the 1980s, the administration would have reacted somewhat differently across all party lines. And right now, we are in a time between what's happening in the Middle East, largely driven by Iran, who's a second-rate player, but you have two demographically dying countries that are desperate for their leaders' personal gratification in China and in Russia that are watching the West, that do have doctrinal designs, and defeating the Russian army right now is one of the best things that we can do. It costs less than 2% of our defense, of our budget, and it doesn't put one American boot on the ground. The problem is if we let this fall, eventually that we will be in a conflict that we're not ready for right now. And I think that going back to the late 1930s and seeing the challenges that we had, in our country on preparing the military for World War II was a very dicey thing because, rightly, we want to be very wary of foreign entanglements. But as one thing that I'll say is Winston Churchill said, the only thing that's worse than fighting a war with allies is fighting one without them. And we're in a very dangerous place if we disconnect from the world because we are that dominant democratic power.
Congressman, what do you make of the Washington mindset? And this is what my objection is to the Ukraine, is we're not all in. I mean, we're trying to fight a war and basically tying one hand behind their back, and we're doing the same thing in Israel, with the Israelis and Hamas, saying, well, you can't fight the war you need to win. And it's like the Biden people seem to think, let's fight to a stalemate, which is, to me, crazy.
Well,
war is to break.
I think you can apply that to both parties, frankly, to factions in both parties. And I'll begin with my party first. Mike Johnson, after the atrocities that happened in Israel, and I served in Israel in the United States Army. The one thing that I would tell you, I've had rocks thrown at me in Gaza. I've had people try to kill me before and different things I've done over there. But the one thing that I'll tell you is Mike Johnson's response, and this is heinous from an American leader who claims to be a Christian, that when he brought forth his bill, it was automatically bad politics, no-go. We're going to cut $15 billion from the IRS. Well, even though I'd like to cut $15 billion from the IRS, he guaranteed, either from legislative ignorance or just playing local politics, that bill would never see the light of day. So here we are, months later, and we haven't provided that assistance. In the same vein, the discussions about Ukraine, and I'm going to speak not as a former member of Congress, but as a Christian. If you are not a Russian Orthodox Christian in the occupied parts of Ukraine, you are persecuted, atrocities have been committed. There are hospitals that are filled in Ukraine and also in Poland with people who've had the most horrifying atrocities done to them. Old men, children of all ages, down to toddlers, and women who've been so violently assaulted sexually that they require major surgery to be reconstructed. Now, whether he's been briefed on that or not, I don't know, but he has been briefed on the gravity of the threat. And so you have a problem in our party with misinformation, frankly, that's coming from the top with Donald Trump, who has no grasp of history. And not that everything that he says is wrong, but he doesn't understand the nature of this conflict and has a really weird kind of relationship in terms of how he perceives Putin, who is candidly still a KGB agent. Over to the Biden administration, I'll put this into a context. I might not have gone on national television and said this as a member of Congress, but I'll say this now, quoting one of my favorite chiefs of staff of a very prominent conservative member of the Senate. He said that Washington, D.C. has the highest number of per capita, highly intelligent, over-credentialed, over-educated, stupid people in the United States. and because of that, let me, that doesn't mean they're bad people. But these are folks who've not served in the military. They've not been downrange. They've not started businesses. They haven't understood how to take risks. Most of them have never been, high school or college athletes. And, understanding the idea of conflict and competition, and life is not everybody gets a trophy. And we're going to affirm you because of how you feel so you can be your authentic self. The reality is that competition and the protections of our freedom is a brutal business. To maintain what we have here. And the administration had bad information, I think, initially, but was utterly feckless over the first summer of 2022 in terms of accelerating the assistance. I'll bring you to the ATACMS long-range Army tactical missile. By not giving them that capability and dithering, frankly, for nearly 10 months after the war began, assured Russia that they had that additional time after Kharkiv was retaken and the initial momentum in September of 2022 gave them literally 8-9 months to build a classic Soviet Warsaw Pact style mine-strewn defense in depth that was going to be very difficult to penetrate regardless of whose army it was that was trying to do it. And so we, sadly, as an administration, have contributed to that problem. I understand the issues with measured risk and not wanting to escalate too much to create further provocation. There's concern about, what Russia might do in a truly desperate situation. But the reality is, and I'm saying this to every listener here that sees somehow that the Russian army is some kind of great entity, they are untrained. They're an untrained rabble. They're poorly led. There's no trust within the system. It's essentially a mob. They've adapted in many ways technologically, as many authoritarian systems will do. But with their overwhelming superiority at the beginning of this war and throughout, they have not been able to move the needle. And we needed to support that. And the thing about ATACMS that is so troubling to me is we're getting ready to demilitarize, essentially dispose of about 5,000 of these missiles to replace them with an even more lethal system that's on the way. And so, my view on that is we don't have any loss on this. To give those types of systems, we should have given them a year ago. We need to give them now. And I think the one thing that I've seen really an awakening across the spectrum among people who pay attention to military policy. And there are many very prominent members of Congress in the media, that see themselves as influencers who make these disparaging statements, but they have no clue historically. They're not policymakers. They're not legislators. They're just simply posturing statements on the gravity of this situation. And, I think it's no different than when we were able to lend the British in 1940 some old destroyers, airplanes, vehicles, things like that, help them get to the point that they could win the Battle of Britain and ultimately stabilize the situation, with the inevitabilities of what was coming in the Second World War. And, I think that appeasing Putin is a mistake. And we need to defeat him. And I'll leave you with one thing. Sorry, I'm talking too long.
No, you're
but
perfect.
The German general staff in World War II was absolutely concerned that if the United States joined the war, that they would be defeated because they did not have the industrial power. Russia understands the same thing. The German general staff knew that once we got a foothold in Europe, they would be defeated. Trump made an ignorant statement. I did my honors work actually studying tactical conflict in the Eastern Front in World War II. The Russians basically did meat assaults then like they do now, but the reason the Soviet Union was able to beat the Germans in the East in World War II was twofold. One was the two-front war that we advanced in the Mediterranean and in Europe when we invaded France and pushed them back. And the second thing that no one's talking about are the 400,000 American trucks, the thousands of airplanes, and the munitions that we sent with no strings attached to the Soviet Union to help bolster their forces to be able to move and have a logistical capability that the Germans, frankly, didn't. And now we're looking at a situation with a democracy that's got some challenges, but they want to change as a people. I think it's the right thing to do. And it doesn't cost us anything. But I also understand, the mental exhaustion after the 20 years in Iraq and Afghanistan that many people in America feel. That feeling was very much alive in the 1930s as people questioned the value of being engaged in World War I.
It's interesting that you bring in the historical perspective. The Lend-Lease was certainly critical. It was almost, like the Russians were trying to copy the German blitzkrieg tactic. They thought they were going to storm into Ukraine, and then the problem, the Germans, their equipment worked, and the Russians, their stuff obviously broke down and had problems. But what is this escalation? We keep talking about, if we give them too much, we're going to escalate. It's a war. The purpose of the war, again, break things and kill people. Okay. And that's how you defeat the enemy. And to sit here and say, well, we're going to have a limited war. There's no such thing. That just means you're playing for a stalemate and then negotiate the outcome, which is never successful.
And Congressman, I want to piggyback on that too, because like these atrocities that you're talking about, the way to win the hearts of Americans is to put this forward. I mean, John and I read news all the time. I have not bumped into that there's hospitals full of, people that have been, I don't know, violated, like you were telling me. I mean, if that gets to the Americans, to me, that changes minds because people, these are humans.
I agree. I think one thing that I would, posit is the media is not particularly effective in covering anything related to faith.
No.
Because the overwhelming majority don't understand it, and that's why you read these weird pieces, trying to to interpret people who are Christians acting in the public space. I'm not a Christian nationalist, by the way. I believe that's heretical, but I'll come back to the fact that we do represent our values when we serve, and they shape our worldview. But as I asked somebody in China who had a master's degree in how to persecute the church from the Ministry of State Security University in Beijing, I asked her, did you ever actually talk to some of these Christians that you're talking about? And she said, why, of course I would never do that. And that's part of the problem is people that are going into the silos here in this country due to social media and, all of the constant barrage of information from almost infinite sources that wants to, place itself as authoritative, and most of it's not true. And I wish that this would be out there more. Certainly, in many ministry circles, if you dig into the places where there are ministries that are working in Ukraine and in eastern, the eastern flank of NATO, that they're dealing with these refugees and these traumatized, injured people. You get a very different story. My wife has a friend here in Central Florida who went over on a mission that we helped her with to spend several weeks dealing with refugees just over the Ukrainian border. She came back devastated by what she saw. And I think that, when Zelensky invited former President Trump to come, I wish he would say yes and go, because but I think there are other factors, the why he wouldn't do that at a personal level. But the reality is, I have one of my close friends from West Point who's been in Kyiv since the war started doing humanitarian work. And it's been a constant stream of this. And part of the problem is you have a dysfunctional society in Russia. Russia is a dying country demographically. Our economy is 23 times bigger than Russia's. Us and the NATO economy is over 40 times bigger. And combined, we're quite more than 2 times the size of China economically. Yet we're playing into the hands of these authoritarian leaders who will rattle the saber a little bit, but literally would have no significant chance at open combat against us. And they know that. And I think that we have to come back to a core point, and this is a Putin doctrine, but it's a long time, Soviet KGB kind of a doctrine too. It is called escalate to de-escalate. And so you'll increase the threat, you'll ramp up the threat with the idea that the other side of your adversary thinks that you're going to do something that's going to take this to an unacceptable level, and therefore they back down. That's how we got appeasement, not Soviet, but in Czechoslovakia in the Munich Agreement in 1938, or at the end of 1938, was the British and French, exhausted by World War I. The idea of going to war was extremely unpopular. So Neville Chamberlain was trying to be a pragmatic politician and cut a deal, thinking that Hitler wouldn't go further, where Winston Churchill, who was a much maligned leader and considered crazy for his pronouncements about the threat of Nazism, was proven true, and thus was elevated as the people woke up to a position of leadership to mobilize the country, to another level for war. And, frankly, I think that people don't realize, because we have literally nobody in a position of leadership in this country in any institutional setting who lived through that time in the Second War, the 1930s and the 1940s, to understand those lessons that were learned. And if you look at the Reagan administration versus, what you might call Trump policy of some of the people who are echoing or auditioning for, roles in national security positions in a potential future administration, it's like all these lessons are ignored, and there's not an understanding of the gravity of these threats. And so we need to take steps to do several things. And I think this is what often gets lost as we live our lives day to day and we're dealing with family and job and friends and church and social groups and things like that, is that maintaining open shipping, freedom of the seas, freedom of trade, and being able to secure that is a huge, huge job creator in the United States. And we are an international trading society. And so, for example, in my old district, the 4th District of Kentucky, across from Cincinnati, basically from Louisville to the West Virginia border, a lot of it's rural, but literally in that district, 40% of the jobs in my district were directly tied to international trade. And so if we lose that, whether it's through our ignorance to allow adversaries to rise up, or we impose maybe well-meaning but really economically dumb tariffs on our adversaries, then or our economic competitors, then what you end up with is exactly the opposite of what you want, and you create economic hardship as well as increasing the threat to the nation. That's exactly what happened in the 1930s, ironically.
Well, how do you blend the Reagan part of peace through strength, and his position was, we're going to build a military second to none, and you try to take us on. When we tell you to stop, we mean stop. Otherwise, we're going to come and clean your clock. And Trump's a little different. Trump's a transactional person. He's a business guy. He thinks of everything as a business deal. That's his mindset. I don't think he, as you point out, he's not thinking strategically or tactically. He's thinking, how do I do a deal with this guy? And those are the terms.
I'll give you a case in point. Lyndon Johnson, who was an extremely effective legislator, maybe we don't agree with his policies, but he was very good at what he did. He misunderstood fundamentally Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam. And ironically, Ho Chi Minh's idol, his hero, historically, was George Washington. And the OSS leader, Archimedes Patty was this guy's name, in Vietnam, recommended to what was becoming the nascent CIA and back into the State Defense Departments that they find a way to embrace him and redirect his nationalism. He had been trained in the Soviet Union, but he wasn't really a communist in that sense. For the most part, it was much more nationalistic. And anyway, Johnson, wanting to prop up the post-Kennedy, post-Diem government, just was convinced he could cut a deal. And he even did things like, well, I can give him water projects and roads and rail and things like that. And the people with the country experience and the cultural experience had a completely different perspective on that. You can't cut a deal. This is an ideological issue related to these people. And for Putin, for Xi Jinping, these are personality cults. North Korea, personality cult. The Iranian leadership ultimately is a personality cult that uses, and they all use a form of religion in the sense of what theologian Paul Tillich called, what is man's ultimate concern, to structure their society around that. And, with Mr. Trump, who claims he's done the greatest things for defense in the history of the country, whatever, what he really did was a significant pay raise to troops, and I'm very grateful for 2 boys on active duty. But the underpinnings of our military institutions and our industrial base, which is so critical to our success in past conflicts and being able to defend this country, doesn't mean we didn't make mistakes. There's been no great country in history that hasn't. But our economic power and our industrial power was at the core of that. And so, we can go on for days talking about things that both parties have done that are wrong. But right now we're making policy decisions, frankly, in both parties that are counterintuitive to good strategic thinking. And going back to your comment about war, Clausewitz said war is politics by other means. And ultimately, if you can't dialogue your way to a solution and one party is intractable, conflict is inevitable, and the way that you prevent that conflict, very simply, is having to paraphrase the Reagan era when I was a young lieutenant or private. Well, actually, I was commissioned by the time Reagan was in, but as a young lieutenant and captain, it's peace through superior firepower. And that's, one of the things that I think gets forgotten about this. We talk about the greatest army in the world, but it's pretty hollow right now.
Well,
in terms of our ability
That's one of my
So
questions too, Congressman, is that it took forever for Biden, to strike back at the Houthis that were sending all of those, strikes against the military, our military. It took him forever. He was thinking about it. And as a soldier, were you not as frustrated as John and I? We've talked about this multiple times. You strike. You don't wait and tell people you're thinking about it.
I remember giving the brief on the Libya operation in 1986 to a whole bunch of pilots the day after it happened for what talking points that we had, from our chain of command, and it was an exciting moment. And I think whether it was Grenada, which I'm glad there wasn't social media for that because it was a lot more complicated in exposing flaws in our joint operations. But what the Reagan doctrine essentially was putting the gauntlet down that we are going to protect our sovereignty and our sovereign interests. And after the saber rattling of his first few years in power, which I think was necessary when you had people like Brezhnev and probably the most dangerous Soviet premier was Andropov, the former KGB leader who'd literally never been outside the Soviet Union. He turned, and from that position of strength, as Gorbachev came in and was able to negotiate a solution, because Gorbachev understood the economic realities of his country, just like those who, on our side, who were really studying the Soviet Union and understood what was happening economically. We're in a similar situation now. And yeah, it was immensely frustrating. My view when the first Houthi put a missile towards an American ship was, some people were going to die. If the Russians have put a device into the, have intention to, or have put a device into orbit that could unleash an EMP on the West and have devastating economic consequences and technological and social, we need to destroy it. It's an act of war. And I, just as an aside, in my stream of consciousness here, I commend my friend Mike Turner for doing what he did when he released that information at the beginning of last week, forced the administration to address this. And the irony is, what did members of the Freedom Caucus do? They turn around and condemn him, saying that he's showing reckless disregard for information. I'm like, my God, this stuff is real. And these people who play at this in politics, no different than the people who stormed the Capitol, and they're making this into some kind of peaceful rally now. I think that when you encounter violence the first time, and I have, and maybe you all have, you realize that this is not some kind of puppies and rainbows storybook reality. Our freedom comes at a great price because of men and women who have been willing to confront that, imperfectly as we do as countries. But that reality and that knowledge is necessary for maintaining order and the protection of our interests. And the reaction that we need to have, this is not, wanton run off to war or anything like that, but it's a clear knowledge that if you pose a threat, we're going to deal with it. And this passiveness is very dangerous on any number of levels, because in the Defense Department right now, they're more focused on climate change and gender and social policy than on actual war fighting. And we're seeing that in spades across the services.
I'm glad you brought up Representative Mike Turner, because I was going to ask you about that. We'd covered that a couple of weeks ago when the story came out. And one thing, I've been reading Aviation Week and space technology for decades. ASAT programs are not new, okay? So this stuff about, they can shoot missiles up and blow our satellites up, and it's like, yeah, they've been able to do that for decades, okay? No big deal. Why suddenly is there this panic, from Washington over the nukes? The EMP stuff, that's not new either. I mean, there's a congressional committee on EMP, I think, about 10 years ago? Read the report. You want to read something frightening, read that report about what an EMP attack would do to this country in 30 days. Go ahead.
I was in classified hearings on this very subject. And the Chinese killed one of their own satellites to prove a point back in 2008 or 9. And I remember making some snarky comments to the charge from the Chinese embassy when he was over in the Capitol one day. But the reality was they were testing a system, but also sending a message. These systems have been around. I chaired a closed panel in 2005 on emerging nuclear threats, the full spectrum. It was a heavy focus on Iran, rogue operations out of Russia and North Korea principally, and got into even a lot more detail that unfortunately we can't have that dialogue on the show right now. But needless to say, these threats are very real. And we don't have to, many of these things don't have to be handled out in the open. Not any different than families having closed discussions as opposed to having all their dirty laundry out in the middle of a restaurant somewhere. Back channel diplomacy can be very powerful in terms of sending messages, regardless of the saber rattling by somebody on the other side. And, in this situation, it was very clear. I just say this now. It was very clear the administration wasn't taking proactive steps, aggressive steps, as Putin was saber rattling, and then they've made these statements. He's talked about other weapon systems that didn't exist that they've developed as kind of a threat, going back to escalate to de-escalate.
Yep.
I think that the gravity, because this technology does exist, the gravity of that kind of a threat cannot be ignored. And I think Mike Turner was actually, and I've known him for 22 years. He's a good man, and he's a great legislator, and one of the few true strategic thinkers in the Congress. And I'll just say that unabashedly. Now, there's some people that, want to believe conspiracy theories about our national security apparatus. I can't help them. But the reality was, the reason that he did this was because action was not being taken to cut this off from becoming a potential escalate to de-escalate threat where we would hold back from doing the things that we needed to do to, A, protect our homeland, and B, to call out this threat. And so we're in a difficult time. And the sad thing, I think, and this is another reason I think Mike did this, our current president does not have the capacity to go in front of the country and give a persuasive, heartfelt speech to tell America and persuade America on why a particular course of action is necessary. And not to get into some of the complicated after-the-fact issue, think about how we all felt after 9/11 happened. And when the president came on the air that night and the message that he gave of reassurance, of hope, that justice would be done, and that we were going to, address this. And in the same way, his speech to the joint session of Congress a couple of weeks later was immensely powerful on this, on that very fact. And that kind of leadership, I think people hunger for. That part of the reason Obama was successful politically was he had that, regardless of the nature of the policies that probably the three of us would largely disagree with. The fact was he was a persuasive communicator, and Joe Biden has never been that. His most recent message that was put out, I think there were over 15 different cuts to it, where they get 3 or 4 words out, and then you'd have like this picture break, and then there'd be more words and a picture break. That's not the kind of leadership we need right now, and we don't have it in the Defense Department. And frankly, that's a challenge, and we don't have it in the State Department either.
I'm just curious on the Defense Department in particular. Do you think our leadership and I go to General Miley here in particular? When he called his Chinese counterpart and told him, "Don't worry about Trump sending nukes, because I'll countermand the order." Is that some kind of? I mean, what's the perception of the Russians and the Chinese and stuff to our military acting like that?
Well, these kind of conversations happened all the time during the Cold War. And in fact, we all look at the missiles of October in 1962 as like the greatest threat to our country. Probably one of the greatest dangers that came was in 1983, 84. I think it was 84, but my brain is old now as a Medicare member now. But the one thing,
we don't believe you, Congressman.
Hey, but what I'll say though is, in Soviet strategic missile forces in that time frame had an anomaly in their software, and these kind of things happen. You need to have a human being in the loop. This is before the concept of Skynet and all of this came out with the Terminator, which came out a year or so later in the theaters. But the big reality though was their system, their command system in the tank, or their version of our Pentagon room that we call the tank, suggested or declared that we were, in fact, launching a major nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, something that was never remotely part of our doctrine, even though there were Soviet leaders that chose or wanted to operate based on false assumptions that, that we had malign intent towards them. But the bigger question here was when that happened, and how we found out about it was seeing them going to effectively our equivalent of DEFCON 1. We escalate to DEFCON 1 immediately because they're going to DEFCON 1. I remember when the alert call came out, I was like, oh my gosh. And because nobody knew what was going on. And the reality is that came down, the solution to that to prevent World War III came down to an American general officer on duty in the Pentagon reaching out and making a phone call to a Russian counterpart. And so I think we can be rational and say that President Trump was suggesting some things that were not appropriate post-election 2020. And it was in, discussions about essentially starting armed conflict against other potential adversaries or peers. That kind of a conversation that reaches out and says, hey, here's what's going on, if it's considered credible, can be a steam valve to let pressure out. But and these back channel dialogues become very important where you can maintain them. I mean, here's a fact on Iraq. When Anthony Zinni was the CENTCOM commander before Tommy Franks took over, and then, we had 9/11 and all the rest of the history, his command in CENTCOM was in dialogue with Saddam's generals for years about catastrophic collapse of Iraq and what steps would be taken to maintain civil order and maintain security and also not give the Iranians an advantage. And that led to the development of Op Plan 100398, 98 being one of the years that Zinni was a commander, and one of the early years, in fact, that calculated what would be necessary to, stabilize in Iraq. And that became the basis for ultimately what our war plans were going to be. And so
well,
dialogue is important.
I mean, are you not frustrated because you're talking about we need a leader that can talk to the American people, and also when leaders are leading and America's number one, then we can help deter these things, Congressman. And I know when we were corresponding, you in the email after we were, I don't know, you sent me one of the emails was like, POTUS, the race is potentially a toss-up for November, and Biden's obviously not running this country. We need a leader because I just feel like since he's been in, America's so weak, and we've got to win. And I know Trump's not everybody's favorite.
Here's a secret. America was weak before militarily in terms of peer-to-peer strategic fights, and for all the bluster and everything. I mean, I made this comment to you. I think in a sense, it's like God has given America over to itself, because the vast majority of the population of this country wants neither one of them in the White House.
Right.
And, when you get 60, 70% majorities say that, that's a pretty good indicator of the frustration of the American people. And as much as, I'll put it this way, because I knew many of these folks who went into the Trump administration were what I would typically call normal Republicans, normal small government, lower taxes, strong national defense, maintain managed trade, control immigration, people who brought about the majority of the successes legislatively were Republicans like us who weren't given over to these weird conspiracy theories. And, for example, for all the attacks on Mitch McConnell, the only reason Donald Trump got 3 Supreme Court justices was, guess what? Because Senator McConnell has been working on that process to gain control of the court, a conservative influence on the court to stop the legislating from the bench since he was a young senator in the mid-1980s. And, the reality is now we have the person who's going to be our nominee, very clearly, who's come out and said he's going to do away with the Marxists and the globalists and, whatever. And I'm kind of like, what the heck is a globalist? If you can't be president of the United States and not believe in the value of international business. I mean, my God, he has lots of international interests overseas. But the reality is that engaging in name calling like that you're going to run a revenge administration of retribution. And I'm here for you. I am your retribution. That is not automatically that's a guarantee that you're going to have real problems if that person is successful. And think about this. Politics is the art of addition. It's adding a coalition to gain and maintain a majority that will support the policies that you are trying to incrementally or in, Hail Mary passes maybe legislatively, but you're trying to move a policy agenda requires you to broaden out that base of support. And as I think I said back in July, all strategy is a math problem. Whether we're talking about our international situation, but I come back to Congress, it's a math problem. It's 218 if you have everybody in the House at 435. It's 60 in the Senate for a non-budget reconciliation or non-confirmation vote, and it's one president who will sign that legislation. And you've got to align those stars. If that's the pipeline that all policy has to pass through. And so in order to get there, it's actually very helpful to not insult the people whose votes you need. And I think that becomes part of the root of this issue, because we're talking about personalities and crazy things that are getting said, frankly, by both candidates, but we're ignoring the actual policy realities of the situation that we're dealing with and what it's going to take to get us out of that. And so before I get off of this, I'll leave you with one other thing. One of the things that cemented the Great Depression and probably contributed massively to propelling Europe into dysfunction and the ultimate rise of the National Socialists and fascism in Italy, to the degree it was in the 1930s, not when Mussolini started out in the 20s, was in fact the Smoot-Hawley trade agreement that was forced through the Congress in 1931, I believe, that basically closed the doors to America by putting excessive tariffs on our trading partners. And what that ended up doing was everybody went into the tank, including us, for a decade, and really until the start of the war. And so I think we have to, again, there's a reason that the post-World War II leaders took the steps that they did, because they had that experience of making those massive mistakes in the 1930s and the 1920s and understanding the reality of where we are. And I think the great lesson that both Democrats and Republicans and what I'll call the center-right, center-left leaders took away from that, growing up, living, serving through that experience, was the fact that we have to, as I'd say as an old Ranger, you have to patrol forward and aggressively. You can't wait for something to come to you. You've got to gain and maintain contact so that you can take steps as necessary or shape the environment in which you're going to function.
So, Congress, is it fixable? To me, I agree with your assessment that the military is weak and it's unfocused. And, the good example that you may be familiar with, the Army recently canceling their future vertical lift program. Yeah, $2.5 billion down the drain. The Navy retiring ships that, are less than 10 years old, trying to retire them because they don't know what to do with them. The Air Force, canceling F-35 buys. There just seems to be this dysfunction in the military. How do we correct that in Washington? Is it just the fact we don't have the leadership in the civilian side, or is the military just leaderless also? As far as the general officer corps go.
Well, I think there are a lot of excellent general officers, but there are also a lot of people who are what I'll call businessmen and women who weren't particularly political until they, got their first or second star and saw big lights. And, I personally experienced this in November. I had to brief a 3-star active duty general in one command who started opining to me about how he was totally committed and knew the Army would be all electric in 10 years.
Oh my gosh!
I'm thinking, I looked at this guy. And I looked at my first reaction. I'm not going to tell you who it was, but I looked at this guy in his Ranger tab and his combat infantryman badge, and I'm thinking, did we serve in the same Army and go to the same school? But the reality is, what he reflected was what the current Secretary of the Army, Secretary Wormuth, is essentially demanding in these senior promotions are people who will bow the knee to the agenda of the administration. And Lloyd Austin did this on an all-hands call with the senior general officer leaders of the Army, all the 3 and 4 stars, in February 2021, and stated that the top 2 priorities of the Defense Department, as the world is unraveling, stated that the top two priorities of the Defense Department were climate change and eliminating white supremacy in the military, and that doesn't exist in the military in any proportion compared to what little there is actually out in America writ large. And one general, one three-star who was on that call, Corps commanders, made a comment, I'm not going to carry that out because it doesn't exist. It's not the right priorities.
So true.
And Austin ripped into him, and the reality was that General said, I'm just going to retire. I'm vested. I'm just going to leave because I won't execute bad policy. Flip side, this type of mismanagement is a challenge. The last general officer who resigned in protest of a presidential decision or directive was Matthew Ridgway in 1956. And that is a problem. And I've had this discussion with numerous Army officers that people choose to stay and say they can make it better. We can look at, situations, no different than the ill-fated walk with the Bible over to the church with Trump back in 2020. That wasn't a good look for the Army on that day. And so we do face challenges, but it can be fixed. The question is I think one of the things we need to do is lower the temperature of the dialogue, so it's not this constant vitriol of extremes, and objectively explain this to people. And it's easier to be a Matt Gaetz who doesn't actually do anything in Washington other than stir crap up. I mean, I've told many young congressmen, and I'm saying this explicitly because of this district that you all are in.
Right.
But one of the things I learned this as a young private in the Army. I learned it as an officer from great NCOs. You have to lead from the front. You have to explain. You have to give orders, but you also want to explain why and what our purpose is and what our mission is. So we are connected to the purpose that's bigger than ourselves. And, in my district, I took some positions legislatively that could be very controversial relative to the equivalent of social media politics at the time, but went out of my way to explain to folks issues that were lightning rod issues. And the response, I'll put it this way at the end, we did a poll about a year before I was done just to kind of see where I was. I'd already made the decision to retire because of my boys getting into high school. But the response was stunning to me, because if I listened to the 40 frequent flyer callers that thought I was part of the one world government or was a crazy right-wing gun-toting Bible-thumping extremist, you'd have thought I was terrible. But I had 90% plus approval ratings among not only the most conservative voters, but Republicans writ large in my district. And I think that's a statement of what we always tried to do. I was on one national talk radio show, and I kept coming back to the facts. And the host, Bill Cunningham, in Cincinnati, has made the comment. He goes, Congressman, you just got too much common sense for talk radio. And I think my making that comment is not bashing talk radio, but I think it's easy to go to the emotional stuff that gets folks stirred up versus the power of that microphone to educate and help people understand the reality of the environment that we're in. And, in our humble way, we tried to do that in Kentucky, but, things come and go.
So, Congressman, I know you wanted to discuss the Freedom Caucus. You had some important things to share with our listeners.
Sure. I'm not a fan, admittedly, and people can join various caucuses. At the end of the day, as one of my friends basically said, this is several years ago, that trying to dissuade an incoming member from joining was you basically give your voting card to folks that don't necessarily have your interest at stake by the way they agree to vote for and against things. And how the Freedom Caucus actually was birthed in 2014 has its roots farther back in the run-up to when we went into the majority. And we saw this in spades after we got into the majority. We had one chamber of the Congress, the House, because of bad candidates that were being nominated, again, going back to all the crazy rhetoric that will fly around in certain circles. The idea was, you've been in for 3 terms, so you're a professional politician. You're really a rhino and a liberal. That's how we lost a seat in Delaware, to a woman who then had to go on TV and claim that she really wasn't a witch. These majorities matter. Controlling these gavels matter. And I'd rather, as I told plenty of people in my very pro-life district, as a pro-life person myself, I would rather see a pro-choice member elected in New England who's a Republican that's going to vote for a conservative speaker who is pro-life than say, oh, no, I can't support anybody who doesn't agree with me 100%. And right after we went into the majority, we began getting attacked by folks like Sean Hannity, Rush Limbaugh, other people of that ilk across the country saying we didn't have the spine or the guts to do what was necessary. Well, guess what? If I control one chamber and nothing gets to the president's desk without passing through the other chamber, and they're going to kill the bill, and they've got a majority that they can do that, and you got a president that says, I will not sign that legislation, guess what? It's not happening in the form that you're there or that you want, so you have to get the best deal you can. And the group, as it continued to move, started wanting to challenge rule votes. We actually kicked Jim Jordan off the whip team because he was encouraging his staff and the Republican Study Committee to go out and tell members to vote against leadership priorities. Try to run an organization where you got active dissent like that. I mean, people can vote however they want to, but at the end of the day, we have to function as a team to some degree. And so as this morphed, I had left Congress, in 2012 or at the end of 2012, but as this continued into the next Congress, we saw this escalate to a new level where you had these folks challenging rules. One of the things that the public, I didn't understand any of this when I got elected, but what the rules actually do is allows a majority in the House to maintain control of the agenda. If you defeat a rule, you effectively hand the floor to the minority. And that's problematic in itself. And since Mike Johnson has become the speaker, I mean, this is historic. We've had 5 rules defeated, largely by these folks in the Freedom Caucus, where perfect was always going to be the enemy of good and what the possible was. And so as the Freedom Caucus started up then in 2014, what did they do? Their great accomplishment was to remove the most conservative speaker in history. Congratulations. What did that really do for you? And they would attack us. And here's the other thing that you need to understand. They would attack so-called rhino Republicans because we would vote for appropriations bills. Well, guess what? I'm going to vote for an omnibus if I've got constituents in the military whose wives are calling me to wonder if their husbands or their spouses are going to get paid. We're going to do the things that we have to do to continue to govern. And this mythology of just shut the government down and it doesn't matter. Well, guys like Jim Jordan come from 70% Republican districts. They can do pretty much what they want, no different than AOC can do coming from New York City. And the members who make the majorities for both parties come from districts that can go both ways. And so again, I come back to what is now a 4-letter word in Republican circles, but compromise is the currency of the realm in a republic. It always has been. And I think again is we need leaders who can rise up and not simply be performers. I mean, I look at a guy like Matt Gaetz, and I'm just going to say this. You've not done anything legislatively. The military, in terms of an institutional setting, has no respect for you whatsoever. And I know this firsthand from many people in senior leadership positions in the military. But the final point, though, that I would tell you is, so you threaten the speaker who was overwhelmingly elected by your conference, where over 90% of your members support him, and you're going to take him down and effectively help Hakeem Jeffries take down his political adversary. And that's exactly what Matt did. He threw the House into complete chaos. We went through 5 speaker ballots. We elected a speaker who was able to get to the necessary number of votes. He was able to get to a majority on the House floor, barely. And what do we have to show legislatively for it since then? Literally nothing. And I think that, and we're going to lose the House, by the way. You can write that down. The House is probably gone because of this kind of behavior. And the American people hunger for leadership. It's why you've seen this pendulum swing back and forth the last several Congresses.
I'm curious, if you've seen the Politico article that came out a couple days ago, it's called A Guide to the 5 GOP Factions Roiling the House.
Yes.
It's one of the stories in our afterburner stack of stuff. And it's interesting that you mentioned the Rules Committee because that's one of the groups that was identified, and they're, Politico being, somewhat leftist. Obviously took a hit.
You're understating that. You're understating that. We can get into their gender terminology policy is insane.
Yeah.
But I'll refer to you both as they. How's that?
Okay.
We can talk
Please don't.
What's interesting, they didn't mention Matt Gaetz at all in the article, which really surprised me. But they did mention Chip Roy, and I'm sure you probably know Tom Massey from Kentucky, and Ralph Norman as the three conspirators that are effectively defeating Johnson's policies by controlling the Rules Committee.
I think when Kevin did something that was very shrewd. When Thomas came in behind me, he was a bit of a bomb thrower through his first several terms in the Congress, and was sort of I think he styled himself in wanting to be the next Ron Paul, always voting no on stuff, and potentially not being a particularly effective legislator. But that's regardless. The people spoke; they voted for who they wanted to, and he's in the position. But one thing I want to commend him on is, as we were heading towards going into the majority, House leadership began cultivating a conversation with people like him, and especially with him. And I think this was one of the mistakes that was made in, when Speaker Boehner was in, and Speaker Ryan, for that matter, too, wasn't able to bridge the relationships. Kevin McCarthy's a lot of things. I know him quite well. I've known him since 2006 when he was in the new member orientation. But he's a good communicator, and he understands, or at least implicitly understood when I served with him, the importance of building coalitions. Not a perfect person by any means, but very clearly was on this trajectory into leadership. And what he did is he worked with Thomas, the incoming rules chairman, Tom Cole, who's a wonderful person on top of being a brilliant legislator and a great student of history. Help to communicate and understand what the purpose of the Rules Committee is. And so, Norman can be an outlier. Chip Roy he's Chip Roy. He was Ted Cruz's chief of staff before running for Congress. So, he was one of the architects of the wonderful 2013 shutdown that got exactly nothing for the Republicans other than potentially putting them at political risk. And the bigger reality, though, and I really credit Thomas with this, is he understood the importance of moving bills through the Rules Committee that were leadership priorities, even if he was going to vote no on the floor, which he often did, but understood that the Rules Committee is an exclusive committee. It's the Speaker's committee, and the reason that it exists is to structure the rules for the majority to control legislation on the floor. Nancy Pelosi is a lot of things. I was her number 10 target in 2004 and her number 5 target in 2006. I know a lot about being on the receiving end of her vitriol, but she's a brilliant politician, and she understood that importance of one, maintaining cohesiveness around policy, but also in that control of the Rules Committee for what could come through and what could go to the floor for any number of reasons. And by weakening the Rules Committee, you essentially and if I were Mike Johnson, candidly, I would start to make changes. At least one member to come off of it, so you have a working majority, so at least you can get legislation to the floor. And that's the purpose of that committee. It's a critical committee, and if a speaker cannot move and a majority leader can't get bills through that committee that do have consensus to pass with an overwhelming majority of our party, of the majority party, then those folks shouldn't be on that committee.
So I know we've kept you a really long time. I just wanted to do a quick rapid fire round and throw out a couple topics, and then you just give me your thoughts real quick. And I wanted to start with the border.
I'll keep it to short.
The border. Let's go. Rapid fire. Your Army. You can do this. Rapid fire on the border. Thoughts on that?
It's out of control completely, and the Democrats are in denial about it. I think one of the reasons that Tom Suozzi won the special election in Long Island last week was specifically because he was speaking to these issues, among others. You see other Democrats coming up, and I think the flashpoint to watch is a Texas Governor Abbott and what he does on the border. And I personally think he's taking the right steps to protect the sanctity of his border by using his National Guard and his state law enforcement to try to close it. I'm disappointed that we didn't move the border legislation that was brought out of the Senate. There was a great deal of misinformation about it, including from our erstwhile speaker, stuff that simply wasn't true. But hey, it's about emotion, not the facts, right?
Okay.
And so I wish we would have gotten that through, because there were significant improvements over the things in there that we tried to get done that we couldn't get through, sometimes because of Republicans way back in the day. But bottom line, as somebody who'd been involved in a lot of immigration legislation, it's out of control and needs to be fixed. And
okay.
It's very straightforward, but we're at a political place of extreme division between the left and right on what are acceptable compromises. And again, nobody wants to compromise, so the problem continues.
Okay. Israel.
The situation in Israel is very serious. I think one of the brilliant things that Yahya Sinwar, a truly evil person, did in that horrible attack filled with terrible atrocities, the worst day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust, was the backlash of the Israeli response. And as I told you yesterday on the phone, one friend of mine who's Israeli makes the comment that, you can't understand Israel unless you understand the Holocaust. And you have two traumatized people between the Palestinians, who are a real people and who were living there before it became the Jewish state, and the Israelis who were there. And the pragmatists in the security apparatus have understood since 1967 the challenges of the occupied territories and what that means. You have desperate people who have very limited rights. Israel has a right to exist, a right to defend itself. I believe we should provide the additional assistance to them. But we're Sinwar and Hamas, who really don't care about their people. They see them as martyrs. I've been in Gaza many times before, it was shut down. But the one thing that I would tell you is that the strategic smart move, he knew the Israelis would overreact. And I think that I go back to this Holocaust analogy of my Israeli friend, political friend told me this, is that there was a cartoon that he had seen many years ago, but this really captures the sense of it, was you have a picture of an armed to the teeth, very muscular Israeli soldier. Think they're Tier 1 special operations units like Shayatet 13 or Sayeret Maktal, staring into the mirror. And instead of seeing himself as he is this powerful warrior, what he sees is a skinny, starving waif with sunken eyes, with his striped pajamas and covered in dirt with his gold star on it. And that populates much of the Israeli mindset and the need to hit back so hard. Netanyahu needs to go. He's extremely unpopular in Israel. I think his most recent popularity is like 15%. And they need some adults in the room like former IDF chief Benny Gantz to lead the country. But ultimately, it's their decision what they're going to do. We need to move the legislation for Ukraine and for Israel and get it there. But at the same time, the most important thing is, what is the day after tomorrow going to be? Because you can't mow the lawn forever. And we could have a whole separate radio show about the Palestinian-Israel situation. I'm happy to do that if you want to.
Okay, and Taiwan. I got to ask you about Taiwan rapidly. Rapid fire here.
Significant Chinese provocation. We need to support Taiwan. I think that China would have a much harder time in a direct action conflict and slowly eroding over time. But, they view themselves internally, not in terms of actual physical boundaries. You think about they quote the 9-dash line for the South China Sea. That's why they have control over it. But but there are many other sovereign nations that have rights too. But internally, Xi Jinping's vision of China is the empire of 1,000 years ago, and wanting, again, not unlike Putin, wanting to restore it's like make America great again. It's make Russia great again, make China great again. We need to do two things. One is provide an adequate level of support to Taiwan, because the amount of shipping that goes through the Bashi Channel in the north end of the South China Sea, or the Straits of Malacca in the southern end of it, is a real constraint for them. And China is on a clock demographically as well. I think it's I think if we can get through the next 10 years without a conflict, economics and demographics will take over. But it's going to be potentially pretty dicey in the near term.
Okay, and last one, America, because this is what we're fighting for.
I'll leave you with John 8:32 in the Greek. That says, Jesus said to his disciples in John 8, he said, if you know the truth, if you're really my disciples, you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. And the question is that we have in America right now is people are going to, whether you're on the far left, and I want to be my most authentic self and live my personal truth. Well, that's not what truth is. The truth that Jesus spoke to, and regardless of the faith walk or lack of faith of anybody who's listening, the lesson of that verse is universal, because the word in Greek, aletheia, that Jesus used for truth is the same word in Greek that was used to convey reality. And so what the Lord actually said was, if you know reality, then reality will set you free. And it didn't mean that there wouldn't be hardship, there wouldn't be challenges, the exigencies of life, but that we would make decisions where the majority of the information that we're using is objective fact. And we wouldn't be doing it on impulse. We wouldn't be doing it on innuendo. We wouldn't be doing it on emotion. And I think getting America back to truth in its communication with its people would be helpful, because both sides are, frankly, reprehensible in the stuff that's pushed out about, different sides. And getting back to that foundation of truth. I'm not going to get into a civility discussion with you, because politics is a brutal sport. But as my friend Mike Pence liked to say, I'm a conservative, but I'm not angry about it. And I think the reaction, and I'll leave you with this other thought, is I think the problem, the view of conservatives and Christians in particular by folks who don't share their views, is two things: fear, that they're scared and fearful, and that they're angry. And if one ascribes to the truths of the gospel, and they build their faith and their walk in life by that, that's you shouldn't be fearful and angry. You don't have a reason to be on the big pictures, because you know who holds the future for you, and you can make decisions, more objectively and calmly. And I think that getting back to let's say a spirit of more truth-based debate in this country on policy, and being able to share differences. I mean, look at the catastrophe in our college campuses. That's the one thing I think that was one of the great values of the horrible things that happened in Israel, is people got to see firsthand the garbage that's being taught in what used to be our major universities. And I wouldn't send one of my children to an Ivy League school if you paid me $1 million and gave them a full scholarship.
Very true.
I thought the poison ivy characterization was very apt.
Yeah.
Well, Congressman Geoff Davis, former Congressman of Kentucky, we've got to have you back. We kept you way over, but you are so incredible, and this conversation was just absolutely amazing. And I look forward to the world hearing it, because you've got a lot to say. So we will definitely have you back. You've got to be a regular.
Great. Hey, well, thank you. I enjoyed the time, and enjoy the rest of your day in the free state of Florida.
We'll be right back on Veronica Live.